The hostages have been released. Today is a day of celebration. And by the time you watch this, this will be news that's a couple days old. But we just want to take a minute and, on behalf of the hostages, their families, their loved ones, Israel, the global Jewish community, and those of us that stand for freedom, democracy, and Judeo Christian values, we want to take a moment and celebrate this moment of freedom for our hostages. So, this is going to be a shorter episode today, and we're going to talk about a couple things. We're all, of course, celebrating the release of the hostages. There's more work to be done. There's still the remains of those that were killed in captivity that Israel is hoping to get back. That's complicated. But I also want to just take a second and thank all of you who have stood by Israel since October 7th. And of course, before that, this situation and what happened on October 7th really set the stage for much of what arises today. And, there was a time when, I'll just say this, after October 7th, I could probably speak for Kalev as well and Simone, sleep left me for a while. Kalev, you remember those early days. I
Sure.
could not sleep. It's all I could think about. And I had to go to work on this. And, Kalev, I'd love for you to talk. We've talked about it before, a little bit about what you did that you viewed as your reserve duty. I know that you and I left much of what we were doing and dedicated our lives for an extended period of time to lobbying on behalf of the release of the hostages. Kalev, can you share a little bit about your perspective on that? What were you feeling after October 7th, on October 7th, after October 7th? And then share a little bit about the work that we did for many, many, many months after that.
Sure. Well, Arise, our organization, up until October 7th, was very focused on economic development, on innovation for good, combating BDS in a smart way by creating more relationship connection and investment, particularly by those Christian evangelical business networks out there that wanted to strengthen the Israeli economy. And we were doing the innovation tours and everything else. Then October 7th, of course, hit hard, and it was a big surprise. And first of all, we were just all in utter shock and trying to digest the terrible images that were coming through our feeds and social media and everything else. And I remember those first conversations with you where we were just like, we have to do something about this. We have to use the network, the tools, relationships at our disposal to help Israel at this time. And the best idea we could come up with at that time, which I think in retrospect really worked, was let's put together a coalition of all these, what we call non-Jewish Zionists, but the majority of them are Christian networks, organizations, and leaders, to unify them in one voice to call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. At that time, there were 250 Israeli civilians, grandmothers, men, women, children, babies that had been abducted from their homes and were being held in these tunnels by Hamas. It was very providential because I think maybe 2 or 3 days after October 7th, I was contacted by the newly formed National Forum for Family Members of Hostages, and they asked us to help lead their international media and diplomatic lobbying campaign. Because we were known as an organization that knows how to mobilize those non-Jewish voices out in the nations on behalf of key issues in Israel. Avishai Zohar, I want to, shout out to Avishai, who was working to us at the time as a PR expert. He was just as highly motivated and engaged as we were. We started to get to work on this. It was my unofficial reserve duty. I'm 51 years old, so I'm a little bit too old to be crawling through the mud with my friends and comrades in Gaza. But I notified the law firm where I work that for the foreseeable future, I will not be coming to work. I'm going to dedicate all of my time, energy, and life to this. And we worked around the clock. You're right. We were like many people, just kind of living on adrenaline at that time, probably getting 3 or 4 hours sleep a night max. Within 2 weeks, we had put together a coalition called the Voice for Freedom Coalition, which was made up of over 3,000 leaders, organizations, networks around the world who are willing to answer the call and to step up, which was such a beautiful thing. I remember making phone calls to people that, I hadn't heard from. Some of them I haven't heard from for 5, 10, 15 years, just reaching out saying, hey, will you join us in doing this? And there was just a fantastic response. We were some of the first movers on the kidnapped posters, which were translated into over 30 languages and dispersed them throughout the world. You, Shimon, were engaged in initiating and managing the billboard project. So we took those kidnapped posters, and I think that we put them on a billboard in all 50 states in the United States. So if people were driving down the highway and saw the posters of those hostages, that was probably funded and facilitated by Arise. And then obviously we helped facilitate demonstrations around the world. So what we did was we mobilized these primarily Christian networks. And it was very unique. I would say, I think in retrospect, it's also important to point out that beyond the Jewish community that at that time was doing a lot of demonstration advocacy, really the only people who stepped up were, not the only, but I would say 90 to 95% were evangelical Christians. They're on the streets demonstrating in Finland and Denmark and England and throughout, Portugal, all throughout Europe and the United States, and basically on every continent, which was just a beautiful expression of, these two communities that came together based on the Judeo-Christian values that serve as the foundation of all our societies, saying this is unacceptable, and they're willing to be a voice on behalf of the hostages. And then the other big thing that we did, of course, was to initiate and manage delegations. And so we took family members of hostages, mothers, sisters, brothers, and fathers, and took them to meetings with state leaders and leaders of international organizations. So we were the first meeting of family members of hostages with the president of the Red Cross in Geneva and the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the United Nations. And of course, we went to Capitol Hill, which was amazing. Mike Johnson, who was just appointed the same week that we took family members of hostages to Washington, D.C., he had just been appointed for the first time as a Speaker of the House. His first press conference on Capitol Hill, and all the press was there because they wanted to hear the new speaker. He literally gave that over to 4 family members of hostages to tell their story. Obviously, we should do a shout out to Johnny Moore from JDA Worldwide that did all the PR around that. Jay Sekulow from the American Center for Law and Justice. I mean, he was representing Trump at that time. Trump was not the president, but he was getting ready to run as president. He was very busy at that time, but he got his whole team and mobilized them in order to help us set up these meetings in Congress and get before media. And if we weren't speaking to a congressperson, then the family members of hostages were doing interviews on, Fox, CNN, BBC, USA Today, Time Magazine, really working around the clock. And then we went and did the same thing. We went with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the government of France, Spain, the European Parliament, European Union. And it was a beautiful thing. All of these events were facilitated by our Christian friends from around the world. And it was I think it was unique because in many places around the world, the Jewish communities are more networked into the liberal side of politics or the left. I would say that's usually the case in most of the countries we went to. And in all the nations that had at that time conservative governments, we really needed the Christians that were more networked into the conservative side of things to set up these events and facilitate them. And obviously, this isn't a political issue; it's a humanitarian issue. And in most countries, we were able to engage both the right and the left, and we built deep friendships. Probably the most valuable thing that I took away from those 6 months of very intense activity around all these delegations are the wonderful friendships, with Yonatan and Idosh Shimriz, with Liron Berman, who finally today, his twin brothers, Liran Berman, his twin brothers, Ziv and Gali, were finally released today, and these last 20 hostages that are still alive. And it was so beautiful to see the pictures of that reunion with Liran. Liran worked his rear end off. I mean, and just any delegation, any trip, any interview we asked him to do. I mean, he was there. He was fighting, and he fought for the last 2 years to see his brothers release. Obviously, Doris Lieber, who fought on behalf of her son, Guy Iluz, who unfortunately died in captivity. And by the way, apparently his remains are some of the remains that are being supposed to be returned today, which, I'm very happy for Doris that she'll be able to bring closure to that part of her life. Although happy might not be the right word. I don't know. It's kind of hard to find words in situations like this. But we forge deep relationships with these people that'll last us a lifetime. When you're in these situations that everybody is just working together, it's like somebody serving next to you in the army that you're kind of, you're in the same foxhole together fighting the enemy. There's no way to explain the depth of relationship and friendship that is forged at times like that. And we're just a small microcosm, a small picture of literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Israelis that did everything they could in their network with their power, their relationship with friends. I mean, I remember back in the beginning, we had, 300, 400,000 young men called up to reserve duty. And so there weren't people left to stand at the gate and be on call as emergency response units within our towns and villages. And in those first few weeks, I remember seeing 60, 70-year-old women holding guns and checking cars coming into my neighborhood. It was just like this is what needs to be done. And so there's such a beautiful thing in the Israeli society that in times of emergency like this, everybody steps up and works together. And right now we're finally reaping the fruit of all of that as all of the hostages are coming home today. And so, I'm just very grateful and thankful. Our hearts are really rejoicing for what's happening. Yeah.
And I just want to say again to our friends, our supporters at Arise, that coalition, the Voice for Freedom coalition of over 3,000 individuals, organizations, churches, NGOs. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Kalev and I left everything that we were doing, and we did it in collaboration with you for many, many months. We beat down every single door that we could beat down until the doors started to close. We got in front of every camera, every microphone. We wrote every letter, every article. And when I say we, I'm not just talking about Kalev and I. I'm talking about those of us that are on our side. We went as hard as we possibly could without rest to do everything we could to see these hostages released until there really wasn't anyone that would meet with us any longer. And much of that led to doing our online advocacy and much of the work that we're doing today through Arise, which so much more of that will be emerging in the months and years to come. We're going to pivot and talk about where we see things going from here, just briefly. But before I do that, I want to once again just say thank you so much to the Christian world for standing alongside Israel in this time. There's this narrative going around, and people are trying to sow division between Jews and Christians, between Israel and America. And I want to just make this bold declaration and just emphasize the fact that this friendship that has existed for many, many years is alive and well. And Israelis today are so grateful for their partners in the non-Jewish community. All of those pro-Israel supporters from around the world that are non-Jewish, non-Israeli, we're so grateful for. And I know I also speak as an American. I know many of my American friends today are celebrating this great victory, this amazing day. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
I want to kind of piggyback on that and also just speak to the Israeli Jewish side of things. What we saw on October 7th, unfortunately, isn't new within, let's say, a broad historical context. Fundamental Islamic jihadists have broken through the gates of communities going back over the last 1,000 years in this attempt to forge and create a global Islamic caliphate. And but back in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, when they were doing this and they were coming in and burning and raping and pillaging and killing, the church got together and said, we have to do something about that. And of course, they sent the Crusades, consecutive Crusades into this region to push back and protect Christian communities and Christian holy sites. But that at that time, there wasn't the same recognition that the Jews and the Christians are kind of part of this together. And many Jews, also suffered at the hands of the Crusades, unfortunately. But it's very important to recognize that we're in a different story today. We're in a different time period where there is a recognition of the same biblical Judeo-Christian foundation of Judaism and Christianity. Many Christians see themselves as, to borrow from the words of the Apostle Paul, as grafted into the olive tree of the Jewish people, as part of the family, and would lay down their lives for the Jewish people in order to protect them from this threat. And it's, there are hundreds, depending on who you ask, there's 400 to 600 million Christians around the world that love Israel, that support Israel, that pray for Israel every day. This network of 3,000 organizations, we put that together in 2 weeks. These are people who got out on the street and demonstrated with a loud voice in their societies against much opposition, in the face of much opposition. These are non-Jews, these are Christians who love the Jewish people. And in our time of need, they stepped up to do something about it. So unfortunately, this threat is not new, but I think the way that we're facing the threat, the Jewish and the Christian community in covenant collaboration together, is a relatively new phenomenon. It's something we really need to recognize, to embrace, to encourage, to facilitate, because I think it's a very, very important opportunity that we as Israeli people cannot afford to miss.
Amen to that. So where's it going to go from here? I want to just say a couple things. One, this isn't over. The war for Israel didn't start on October 7th, and it didn't end today, and it's not going to end this week. The war in Gaza may be coming to an end. We're very optimistic with a significant dose of reservation in the mix because we are observers and students of history. But I want to make it clear that the Free Palestine movement didn't start on October 7th. October 7th was a result of a war that's been going on since the formation of Israel and even before that in 1948. And, you've heard it said, maybe you've heard it said, maybe you haven't, that October 7th was really like a flare being shot up into the sky where you could see your enemies. And I'm not talking about in Israel. I'm talking about globally. October 8th is what was equally as shocking as October 7th and the massacre that took place. And the years since then, it changed the world forever. And that's not going to be over. I don't think it takes a lot of insight to predict that. The Free Palestine movement isn't about Palestinian human rights, and it isn't about land. It never was. It doesn't mean that some of the people that bought into that weren't concerned with those things. But that movement didn't start on October 7th. It didn't start with the war on Gaza, and it didn't end today, and it's not going to end for the foreseeable future. And so we can certainly count on. The question is going to be, where is it going to go from here? We know that it's going to go on. For those of you that work in the digital space and in the influence space, do you think that the opponents of Israel are going to stop? Do you think Candace is going to stop because this war in Gaza is over? Do you think Tucker is going to stop?
No,
they're
they'll
not.
lose their followers.
That's right. They're going to double down. And I want us to be prepared. I know this is a day of celebration, and that's why we don't want to make this a long episode and make this about this. But I also want to put a flag in the sand and for this to be a rallying call. And we need to be prepared because, we know how they're going to portray, as press is going to be able to have access to Gaza. We know how Israel's going to be portrayed in advance. It's not going to be positive. I think we can be confident of that. Although more details are emerging about the civilian to combatant ratio and stuff like that, yet to be seen. We don't want to get into all those details, but I want to just paint the broad stroke picture and let all of those of you that have fought alongside us for these years know that this isn't over, and it's probably going to get, on the diplomatic and advocacy front and media front, it's probably actually going to get worse. If you think that these conspiracy theories are going to go away, they're not. These people are building massive audiences on these insane theories and proclamations and declarations and accusations towards Israel, and they are not going to jeopardize their platforms and their money going away.
I think we can get very specific. I shared with you this report last week, Shimon, by an organization called ISGAP, ISGAP, and they're talking about the over $1 trillion of Qatari money that's been invested to buy up influence in the West through media companies, sports teams, education. And so what we know very specifically, Qatar, which is a Muslim Brotherhood, radical Islamic ideology, sitting on a lot of money. So only 350,000 citizens in Qatar, and they provide about 60% of the world's liquid gas, which translates into trillions of dollars of expendable cash, right? So we know that they pay billions of dollars a year to Russian bot farms, each one with millions of devices, to completely manipulate the algorithms within social media. So for every, pro-Western, pro-Judeo-Christian, pro-Israeli video, there's going to be 50 to 100 videos going in the exact opposite direction. And according to the ISGAP report, Qatar has given over $100 billion of investment, or quote unquote donations, to American universities and about 8,000 K through 12 schools over the last 2 decades. Like you said, this started long before October 7th. They're trying to purchase the heart of the West through education and media in order to destroy the Judeo-Christian foundations of Western civilization, and by extension, Israel. And I agree with you that they'll double down. By the way, I think the reason that we're getting all the hostages released is exactly for this reason. We said from the beginning, Qatar is the only country that has leverage over Hamas, because even since October 7th, they continue to give $40 million a year to Hamas. They're funding a terrorist organization. They're harboring a terrorist organization. They're protecting their leaders in their capital city, Doha. And they thought they could get away with it because they have good relationship with the United States, and they're defined as a major non-NATO ally. Same definition of the relationship with Israel, by the way, strategic ally of the United States. And so when Israel had the failed assassination attempt in Doha of Hamas leadership, which Amit Segal, who's a great Israeli journalist, he said it was the most successful failed assassination attempt ever. Why? Because Qatar realized they expected a huge outcry against this in the West from the United States and everybody else, that everybody would come down and condemn Israel. But when they saw that didn't happen, and that regardless of these hundreds of billions that they've invested in order to influence the West, as long as Hamas is still holding those hostages in Gaza, there's not going to be a big pushback. And Israel is legitimized in going after these terrorist leaders living in Doha. I think the coin dropped. And until that time, they were coming to the negotiation table and purporting to be this, objective mediator. But we know from behind the scenes that they were just coming and negotiating in order to keep Hamas in power, in order to keep Hamas alive as long as possible. They were pushing these ideas of the staged release of hostages, 1 or 2 per week, etc. Why? In order to keep Hamas alive. But all of a sudden, after that assassination attempt, when they understood that the West will never, in the majority, let's say the sane majority, will not legitimize Hamas, all of a sudden they changed their tune and said, no, we want all the hostages to be released and the war to be over as soon as possible. And so I think that now they will try to double down. It's the battle out there over public opinion will just grow stronger, and we'll need the voices of our friends out there in the international community more than ever.
And this is a time, I do think it's important for the world to understand that Qatar is playing chess. They're thinking long game here. The conservative right, in my opinion, are playing Uno. Not even checkers. They're playing by themselves. This whole isolationist movement that basically wants to put its head in the sand and ignore that there are enemies of the United States. There are enemies of democracy. There are enemies of freedom. There are enemies of Judeo-Christian value that are waging a war on all of those things. And it's not passive, it is active, but they're playing chess. They're going about it in a very, very smart way. And we need to wake up and we need to play chess as well. And so we at Arise, we're going to keep doing that. You're going to be hearing more and more about how we do that in the upcoming days. And I want to say this battle, as Kalev said, didn't start on October 7th, and it didn't start decades ago when Qatar started pumping all of this money into the West. That was also a result of decades. I'm talking about 5, 6 decades or more of this battle that's been going on. And if you want to know more about it, watch our last episode, because that episode is so important. If you want to know what's behind a lot of this, and I'm not going to call it out here, and the reason I'm not going to is because the algorithm denied that episode. You probably didn't watch it because there wasn't a way that we could actually get it out there and promote it on the platforms. If you want to understand some of the origins of this conflict and why is Israel, which makes up less than 1/4% of global population and is less than 1% of landmass on the planet, why does it dominate the news feed? Why are you hearing about it every single day? Why is it in your social media channels? If you want to know the answer to that, watch our last episode. This is really, in many cases, not about the Jews, and it's not about Israel, and it's certainly not about Palestine, Palestinian human rights. It is much deeper, much greater, much more vast than that, and we need to understand that, and that's what we're talking about here. That battle is not going to go away. It is the real World War III, and it is being fought not militarily right now, thank God, but it is being waged in the battle for public opinion, and we are losing. And when I say that we are losing, I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about democracy, freedom, Western civilization as we know it, and the values, Judeo-Christian values that we have benefited from, lived under, the foundation upon which the United States was born. That's the foundation that it was built upon. That's what's under attack here. You're hearing about Judeo-Christian values. If you want to know more about what that is, what does that look like? What are those? And how does all of that work? We're going to unpack some of that in our next episode, so you want to tune into that. I'm going to wind this down and give Kalev the last word. Again, we're so grateful for those of you that are in the trenches with us and have been.
Since this is an episode about expressing a lot of joy and gratitude, I just want to thank the United States, the administration of the United States, people from both sides of the aisle, actually, that have supported Israel and the Jewish people through this very difficult period. And I would say this agreement that's been negotiated for the end of the war and the release of the hostages is nothing less than brilliant. And so everybody that had anything to do with that in the administration, just a big thanks from this Israeli, that you would honor the friendship between our countries and help us get our loved ones and family members and friends home. So we're just very thankful to God for you, and thankful to God for the great partnership and alliance between our countries. And this is a day that we should all be celebrating together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. A quick like, quick subscribe, quick share, and thank you, and stay tuned.